On a beautiful summer day in mid-June 2009, 37-year-old Caleb Harrison walked out the door of Maplehurst Prison in Ontario, Canada. He was a free man once again. Behind him, the correctional facility where he had just spent the last 3 months stretched out over a total of 106 acres, one of the first so-called super jails in Canada's most heavily populated province. Still feeling like a prison guard might stop him at any moment, Caleb forced himself not to hurry as he walked towards the visitors' parking lot. Just a few more minutes, he thought, as he looked down at his watch, and his mother would be pulling into the parking area right in front of him. And when she did, Caleb would climb into the comfortable passenger seat of the family car, and in 20 minutes, the two of them, mother and son, would be turning on to Pitch Pine Crescent, a leafy and quiet street in an affluent neighborhood of Ontario's third largest city, Mississauga. They would pull into the driveway of the airy and modern 6-bedroom house where Caleb's parents, Bridget and Bill, had lived for 40 years, and where Caleb, adopted at the age of 6 months, had grown up. Coming to a stop now, a few feet away from the curb, and willing his body to finally relax, Caleb tried to remind himself of how lucky he was. Not many of the inmates he'd met had a family that was as supportive and financially secure as his was. Not all of them would ever stand outside like he was, knowing that they had a ride and a place to go. But despite knowing all of that, Caleb did not feel like a lucky person. He had only been an inmate at Maplehurst for 12 weeks, but during that time, his old life had taken so many twists and turns that it seemed like it had become a total thing of the past. Something that felt as unfamiliar to him now as the cheap prison-issue clothes he was wearing and the sight of the open sky overhead when it wasn't circled by barbed wire and prison guards. And as Caleb stood there, holding on to his small bag of personal belongings and scanning the cars coming down the drive into the parking lot, he thought about that decision he'd made 4 years ago that had landed him in Maplehurst in the first place and caused tragedy for so many people. At the time, of course, Caleb had had no way of knowing he was making the worst decision of his life. The year had been 2005, and Caleb had been 33 years old. It had been a cool and clear Friday night, the first day of July, and 3 of Caleb's friends in Mississauga were going to a party. Caleb had offered to go as their designated driver, the one person in the group who would not drink and who would make sure he got the rest of them home safely. Thinking back now to that night, Caleb remembered how completely sure he had been that he wouldn't even be tempted by the alcohol, because just a few weeks before that party, he'd been shocked to find himself locked up in jail for a few days after his wife had accused him of hitting her. Caleb, who had been drinking at the time, had told police that he acted in self-defense after his wife had come after him. He'd been released from jail, but one of the conditions of his parole was that he would not touch alcohol. After that accusation of domestic violence, both Caleb and his wife Melissa had known that their 5-year-long relationship was basically over. And when the end came, it wasn't exactly a surprise. Ever since getting married in 2002, their life together had been rocky. Caleb drank too much, neither one of them was good at managing money, and Melissa had a habit of exaggerating any drama in her life, like the time she was diagnosed with an ovarian cyst, but told Caleb she'd been diagnosed with cancer. But the one really good thing to come out of their marriage had been their 2 children, and Caleb had been terrified that if he violated the conditions of his parole, Melissa might not let him see their 3-year-old son and 2-year-old daughter. But it was just the thought of all those problems and failures that had put Caleb in such a bad mood that night all those years ago that he decided to have just one drink at that party, just to make himself feel a little bit better. And since it was only going to be one drink, he'd passed on a beer and went straight for the hard liquor. By the time the party had been over, Caleb had had nearly 3 times the legal limit of alcohol in his bloodstream, and he was totally deaf to his friends telling him he had no business getting behind the wheel of his mother's Mercedes car, and that there was no way they'd get in the car with him. Leaving his friends to walk home, Caleb had stumbled into the driver's seat of the powerful vehicle, turned on the engine, and made his way out onto the main road that led back to his parents' house on Pitch Pine Crescent. Thinking back now on what happened next, Caleb gave an involuntary shiver, and despite the sun on his back, he suddenly felt ice cold. All he remembered was the dark, empty road in front of him suddenly filling with the headlights of the oncoming taxi that was carrying a driver and 4 passengers. Traveling at 60 miles an hour, Caleb had drifted into the oncoming lane, and in a shriek of tearing metal, he had hit the other car head-on. The collision had killed the 44-year-old taxi driver. 2 of his passengers made it out of the wreck with minor injuries, but the third man in the taxi had had his scalp sheared completely off of his skull, while the 4th man suffered a broken arm and a broken back. Caleb had been lucky. A passerby had dragged him out of his car just before it burst into flames, and the worst injury Caleb suffered was a broken leg. Caleb also knew he'd gotten a sweet deal from the Canadian legal system, which was known for moving very slowly. After the drunk driving accident, Caleb had been charged with manslaughter, which is unintentional murder, but it had taken the court a solid 3 years to try his case. And during that time, he'd been allowed to live with his parents at 3635 Pitchpine Crescent, and despite Melissa's objections, Caleb had also been allowed to share custody of their children, Mason and Michaela. And even though Caleb was ultimately found guilty of involuntary manslaughter, the judge sentenced him to only 18 months in prison instead of the 2 years that the prosecution had asked for, or the 5 years demanded in an online petition that was circulated on Facebook in the years before Caleb's trial actually took place. But the shorter sentence had come with a price tag. There had been an opinion piece that ran in the local newspaper, read by nearly 500,000 Mississauga residents, that called the 18 months nothing more than a, quote, slap on the wrist. And those same concerned citizens, along with the families of the deceased taxi driver and the passengers who had been injured in the drunk driving accident, were outraged all over again when Caleb had only served 3 months before being released because of good behavior while behind bars. And no one had been more upset than Melissa. Caleb's decision to drink and drive proved to her that he was an unfit father. And once Caleb had been sentenced to 18 months in prison, the courts transferred his custodial rights over to his parents. By then, his parents, Bridget and Bill, were so involved in the lives of their grandchildren that Melissa felt like she was sharing custody and organizing her kids' lives around the schedules of 3 people, and not just her ex-husband. So it was no wonder that by the time Caleb actually walked into his concrete prison cell at Maplehurst on March 9th, 2009, there was no sign left of the young couple who had fallen in love 9 years earlier. That was when Caleb and Melissa had first met while working in a store in Mississauga called My Favorite Doll. 19-year-old Melissa worked at the front counter, and Caleb, 8 years older than Melissa, had worked in the huge shipping and receiving department out back. Their romance had unfolded under the smiles of hundreds of tall, slender Barbie dolls in every style and color, stacked floor to ceiling, all standing on long legs inside their clear plastic capsules. And Melissa, with her girl-next-door good looks and her longing to get married and start a family, had seemed as perfect to Caleb as one of those dolls. Except that once they had exchanged their wedding vows, moved out of their parents' homes and into their own place 30 minutes away, and almost immediately had their first baby, the reality that had set in for Caleb and Melissa was anything but perfect. Probably the best thing that had happened for either of them since they broke up was that Caleb had met a wonderful new woman online and they had begun a serious relationship, and Melissa had also met someone new. Caleb's girlfriend, Corinda McEwen, had 2 children from an earlier relationship who got along great with Caleb. Melissa and her new boyfriend, Christopher Fattore, who went by the nickname Chris, had quickly become engaged and started a family of their own. But aside from meeting those other romantic partners, it seemed to Caleb that his life was cursed, because exactly 5 weeks after he had started serving his prison sentence, he had gotten absolutely devastating news. On the cold, clear evening of Thursday, April 16th, 2009, Caleb's mother had returned home from work to find her husband Bill, Caleb's father, slumped against the wall of the downstairs bathroom, dead. According to the Peel County Medical Examiner, the cause of death was acute cardiac arrhythmia, a rare interruption in the heart's natural rhythm that can cause sudden and unexpected death even in a person as active and healthy as 64-year-old Bill Harrison had been. Meanwhile, Caleb's ex-wife, Melissa, seeing her children's lives unraveling in tragedy, their father in prison, their grandfather now dead, had abruptly decided to take the issue of custody into her own hands. Packing up her and Chris's belongings, along with Caleb and Melissa's two children, Mason and Michaela, and the new baby that Melissa and Chris had had together, they had all simply left Mississauga behind, disappearing without a trace and telling no one where they were going. Still reeling from the recent death of her husband, when Bridget realized her grandchildren and their mother were now just gone and she couldn't get in touch with them, she immediately filed an abduction report with Peel Regional Police. At the same time that she filed the report, she also petitioned the court for full custody of Mason and Michaela once the children were located. And then Bridget had to tell her son that not only was his father dead, but also that his children had been abducted by his ex-wife and nobody knew where they went. Still looking out over the visitors' parking area, Caleb had not even realized he was holding his breath until he saw his mother's car drive through the open security gates leading into the parking lot. Stiffening involuntarily, Caleb made another conscious effort to relax, forcing himself to take a few deep breaths. Then he stepped off the curb and started walking towards the space where his mother had just angled the car and come to a stop. As 62-year-old Bridget Harrison turned off the car engine, opened the driver's side door, and stepped out onto the pavement to give her only child a long, tight hug, her green eyes filled with tears. She'd still had no word from police about where her grandchildren were, and like Caleb, she was wondering just how much worse her life could get. 2 months had gone by since Bill's death, but instead of time making her feel any better, each day seemed to bring a new wave of grief. Even now, holding the son she loved, Bridget doubted that she'd ever recover from Bill's death. And it wasn't just because they had been married for more than 40 years. It was the fact that from the first time Bridget and Bill had met, working together at the theater festival in Stratford, Ontario back in the early 1960s, they had formed a deep bond of both love and friendship. Bridget had been an accomplished young actress who went on to have a high-profile career in the field of education. Bill had worked backstage and had gone on to have a successful career in management, eventually becoming a top executive of Sobeys, a large Mississauga-based company that owned a chain of grocery stores. Looking down into his mother's sad and tired face, Caleb also felt the terrible absence of his father. He and his mother loved one another, but it was his dad who had been the steadying presence in both of their lives, smoothing over arguments and bringing out the best in all three of them. As Caleb settled himself into the front passenger seat of his mother's car, he took one last look at Maplehurst Prison. Just a minute earlier, when he had helped his mom back into the car and closed the door once she was in the driver's seat, he had tried to imagine what it was going to be like to walk into the house at Pitchpine Crescent and pass that downstairs room just inside the entrance where his father had died. Caleb would not miss prison, that was for sure. But as his mom backed the car up, turned, and drove out of the parking lot, it occurred to Caleb that at least here at Maplehurst, when he woke up every morning, he knew exactly what to expect out of each and every day. And in a weird way, that was very comforting. 5 months later, on November 27, 2009, Caleb and Bridget got the good news they had been praying for. The Peel Regional Police had located and then arrested Caleb's ex-wife, Melissa, on charges of parental abduction of their two children. For 7 months, Melissa and her new partner, Chris, and the children had been living under false identities in the tiny township of Londonderry, located in Nova Scotia, the easternmost province of Canada, more than 1,000 miles away from Mississauga. During that time, Melissa had given birth to her and Chris's second child. It wasn't until Chris accidentally signed a rent check using his real name that local police contacted Peel Regional Police in Mississauga to say that they might have located Caleb's missing children. For Caleb and his mother Bridget, having Mason and Michaela safely back home at 3635 Pitchpine Crescent felt like the start of a new life for all four of them. Melissa would have to stand trial on parental abduction charges, and eventually she and Caleb would work out a shared custody arrangement again, but for now, at least while she was out of jail on parole awaiting that trial, Melissa had to stay away from Caleb and their two kids, giving Caleb the time and space he had dreamed of having so he could once again bond with his kids. But if Caleb and Bridget thought that just by having Mason and Michaela back home, that the hole in their lives caused by Bill's death nearly 8 months earlier would disappear, they were both wrong. Instead, without Bill's calming presence and laid-back attitude towards life, the relationship between Caleb and Bridget grew very tense under the stress of working and also now caring for 9-year-old Mason and his 7-year-old sister, Michaela. Still, despite the friction, by early spring of 2010, Caleb, Bridget, and the kids had all settled into their routines of work and school, and mother and son both hoped that once they passed the anniversary of Bill's death, they would be able to put at least some of their grief and pain behind them. On Wednesday, April 21st, 1 year and 5 days after Bill Harrison had died, 9-year-old Mason Harrison left school at about 3 p.m. and walked home to Pitch Pine Crescent. This was unusual for Mason. Since leaving Nova Scotia and living with his grandmother and father, Mason really couldn't remember a time like today when neither of them had been there after school to get him and Michaela. But since Mason was now old enough to go home on his own, he figured he'd find his grandmother at the house and just remind her that she needed to go out and get his younger sister. And Mason didn't mind. It was a cloudy but mild afternoon, and having this responsibility to walk home made him feel grown up. It was about 3:30 p.m. when Mason finally arrived home. As he walked up the driveway to the front door, he saw his grandmother's car in its usual spot, so he wasn't surprised when he didn't need to use his own key to open the door. Instead, he just walked inside, already slipping the straps of his backpack off his shoulders. But before he could even call out his grandmother's name, Mason suddenly stopped, like he was frozen in place. Because there, at the bottom of the carpeted stairs right in front of him, was his grandmother. She was sprawled out on the ground, not moving. Fully dressed, Bridget was lying on her back with her head and shoulders on the first and second step and her feet and legs on the floor. On her feet were the lightweight slip-on shoes called Crocs that she liked to wear, and scattered around her were her purse and glasses. Her arms lay out to her sides, and her green eyes were wide open. It was the sight of his grandmother's open eyes staring up without blinking that broke through Mason's sense of total shock. Dropping his backpack, he raced out the door to their neighbor's house across the street, calling out desperately for help. Within 30 minutes, Pitch Pine Crescent was lined with the emergency and police vehicles that had responded to the neighbor's 911 call. And as bright yellow crime scene tape went up around the Harrisons' property and word got around that something had happened to Bridget, it wasn't long before Caleb had called a ride and then rushed to the house from work. And once Caleb was there, it wasn't long before he was joined by the same family members who had rushed to this same house just over a year ago when it was Bill who had been found dead just a few feet from where his wife now lay. It also didn't take police long to arrive at some preliminary conclusions about Bridget's death that would ultimately echo the conclusions they'd reached when they'd investigated Bill's death. The coroner, who arrived at the scene to examine Bridget's body, noticed enough injuries, like some bruising on Bridget's neck and chin, that he did not immediately rule out the possibility of foul play. Instead, he described it as a suspicious death and sent Bridget's body downtown for a full forensic autopsy. But there wasn't much else about the scene that pointed to anything other than a tragic and deadly fall down the stairs. There was no forced entry, no sign of a struggle, and when the autopsy report came back 2 days later on Friday, April 23rd, it said that Bridget's broken neck and all her other injuries were consistent with just such a fall. But even though the Peel County Homicide Bureau was not called in to investigate, the fact that 2 family members had died in the same house within a 13-month period of time raised a lot of red flags for the public, members of the Harrison family, and law enforcement. So, over the next several weeks, local investigators did some digging around on their own. And the first name at the very top of their list of people of interest was Bridget's son, Caleb. Investigators had already learned from interviews with neighbors and family and Bridget's work associates that the relationship between Caleb and his mother had been difficult, especially since Bill's death the year before. And even though Melissa was already in the process of being granted supervised access to Mason and Michaela, the custody battle that had started nearly 5 years ago had taken its toll on Bridget as well as Caleb. Not only did Bridget have to drive the children to and from school and to after-school and social activities, she also had to drive around her adult son, Caleb, because his license had been suspended following his conviction for drunk and reckless driving. But investigators quickly hit a series of dead ends. Caleb had a rock-solid alibi for the time of his mother's death. He had been at work that entire day. And when police then turned their attention to Melissa, it didn't take long for her and her husband Chris to also produce alibis for the day of Bridget's murder. By September 2nd, 2010, 5 months and 11 days after Bridget's death, police concluded that there was no evidence of any criminal action, and the investigation was closed. But for Caleb, there was no escaping the aftershocks of his mother's death. Although Melissa had the children for supervised visits, Caleb was still the sole custodial parent, and even without his mother's help, he had full responsibility for Mason and Michaela. And now the three of them lived inside a house where both Caleb's parents had died, and where Mason had been the one to discover Bridget's body. And while police might have cleared Caleb as a possible suspect in the death of his mother, he could still feel the cloud of suspicion that seemed to float over his head. And he also knew people were talking. Could it really be a coincidence that both of Caleb's parents had died in accidental but unusual circumstances? And given the public outrage over Caleb's driving drunk that caused the death of one person and the brutal injuries of two others, could it be that someone was out to punish Caleb and the whole Harrison family? As Caleb sank into a depression, he started to drink again, and it wasn't long before his girlfriend, Corinda, broke off their relationship. Melissa, meanwhile, had left Mississauga altogether. She and Chris had taken their growing family and moved to a farm in Perth County, almost 2 hours to the west. Even though Caleb had sole custody of his children, which was very contentious, the 50-mile distance between him and Melissa had eased a lot of tension between the parents, and Caleb was allowing Melissa more unsupervised time with their two kids. But all that changed on March 1st, 2013, when a freak fire destroyed Melissa and Chris's small brick bungalow out in Perth. Melissa and Chris were able to save themselves and the children, but the fire killed the family's pets. Heartbroken and unable to come up with the money to rebuild their little dream home, Melissa and Chris packed up and came back to Mississauga. But for Caleb, the sudden proximity to Melissa, which should have made sharing custody even easier, resulted in friction, not harmony. During the 2 years that Melissa had lived in Perth, Caleb had worked hard to get his act together and be a good father. He and Corinda were back together again, and he had a steady job at CMC Electronics. He still couldn't drive himself, but he'd arranged for a neighbor to take the children to and from school. Caleb still had periods of depression, but he no longer thought about killing himself the way he had after his mother had died. The children were 12 and 10 years old now, and most days Caleb just took them to the park. He'd even started following his own father's footsteps by volunteering as the kids' baseball coach. With Melissa now living practically right around the corner and always looking to find fault in Caleb's parenting, Caleb had decided that when this summer was over, he'd go back to allowing Melissa only supervised access to their kids. He knew Melissa would go to court and ask for shared custody, but for Caleb, these supervised visits gave him the control he needed over his life and schedule with the kids. But even though Caleb's life was improving, it didn't take much to throw him off his stride. And that's exactly what happened on Thursday, August 22nd, 2013. Caleb had been looking forward to spending that evening and night with Corinda. The two of them had planned to take Caleb's kids to the kids' baseball games, and then after watching the kids play, they would drop the children off with Melissa, and then Caleb and Corinda would spend the night together at Pitch Pine Crescent. So Caleb had been more than disappointed when Corinda had told him earlier that day that because of a school commitment, she would not be able to join him after all. And when Caleb called Corinda from his house at 11 p.m. that night, sounding drunk, the two of them had gotten into a fight. Upset, Caleb had ended the call and turned off the ringer on his phone, and then decided to go to bed and watch a movie until he fell asleep. The next morning, Friday, August 23rd, the Harrison family house cleaner pulled up in her car in front of 3635 Pitch Pine Crescent. Carrying her supplies, she let herself into the house with the key Caleb had given her and wasted no time getting to work. Caleb had a standing request to the house cleaner that she not enter or clean his own bedroom upstairs, but even so, 3635 was a big house, and the cleaner had just started on the other 5 bedrooms when she was interrupted around noon by a sudden loud knock on the front door. It was one of Caleb's colleagues from CMC Electronics, and as he explained to the housekeeper, he was there to check on Caleb, who had not shown up for work that morning. A few minutes later, the housekeeper and Caleb's coworker had opened the door of the master bedroom where Caleb slept. Looking into the room, they both let out a sigh of relief. Caleb must have just overslept. That's why he had not gone to work, because there he was, lying in bed, the blanket pulled up to his chin, the edges tucked in around him. It wasn't until Caleb did not respond to being shaken awake that his coworker checked for a pulse and then realized that the 40-year-old father of two and the third member of the Harrison family was dead. Within minutes, Pitch Pine Crescent was once again awash in flashing lights and emergency vehicles, and it wasn't long before the same family members who had come to this house when Bill and Bridget died were once again ducking under a fluttering perimeter of crime scene tape to talk with law enforcement. And it wasn't just family that was experiencing a sense of déjà vu. Looking up at the high windows and sloped roof of 3635 Pitch Pine Crescent, the first paramedic on the scene turned to his partner. What he said would be repeated by other responding officials. You know what? I've been here before. Only this time, there was one huge difference, because this time, the Peel Regional Police Force knew right away that there was nothing accidental or natural about Caleb's death. Looking down at Caleb's body, the injuries were obvious, swollen knuckles like he fought hard to defend himself, along with deep scratches on his chest. And the bruising and abrasions on his neck would later provide evidence of the actual cause of death, strangulation. And suddenly, 4 years after the fact, a new team of investigators would begin to see the deaths of Caleb's parents, Bill and Bridget Harrison, 5 years ago, in a whole new light. Going back to the earlier reports on those deaths, the parallels to Caleb's death were startling and obvious. In 2005, the medical examiner had reported finding faint abrasions around Bill's neck too, along with a broken sternum, the long flat bone that protects the heart and forms the center of the chest. Police at the time had concluded that the neck abrasions were caused by a necklace that might have been tightened around Bill's neck when he collapsed in the bathroom. They also concluded that the broken sternum could have been caused by the same fall, triggering the heart arrhythmia that the doctor had listed as Bill's cause of death. Now, it looked like a blow to the chest, and manual strangulation could have caused those injuries. Likewise, the examination of Bridget's body 1 year later in 2006 had also revealed neck abrasions and evidence of neck compressions that could be consistent with strangulation, and the other injuries to her body could have been caused not by a fall down the stairs, but by a brutal fight with an attacker. It didn't take long for Harrison family relatives, along with the Canadian press, to draw their own conclusions. This was no coincidence. The Peel Regional Police Force had failed to do a thorough job investigating those earlier deaths, and now an entire family had just been wiped out. This time, the investigation into Caleb's death was handled not by local police, but by the Peel Regional Homicide Bureau. Since police had never ordered an autopsy on Bill's body, which was cremated 2 days after his death, and because the investigation into Bridget's death was now seen as very superficial, the new team of investigators basically had to start all over again from scratch. Only now they believed they were looking not at a single murder, but at a double or even triple homicide. By the afternoon of August 23rd, detectives were combing the Harrisons' neighborhood, going door to door to interview neighbors, searching for potential witnesses and video footage that might provide any clue to the murderer's identity. By that evening, they were interviewing Caleb's girlfriends, his ex-wife, his friends, co-workers, and family members. And once investigators took a giant step back and reviewed and then pieced together all the information and records and witness statements related to the Harrison family deaths, going all the way back to Bill's sudden supposed collapse 5 years earlier, a very new and shocking theory about what happened to the residents at 3635 Pitch Pine Crescent began to emerge. And this time, homicide detectives had a critical piece of physical evidence that might help them prove their suspicions. During the autopsy on Caleb's body, the medical examiner had found human tissue under Caleb's fingernails that investigators believed must belong to Caleb's murderer. And by the end of August, just over a week after Caleb's death, investigators had found the DNA match they were looking for. It would take investigators another 5 months to put together their case. Based on all the evidence they collected through interviews, search warrants, secretly recorded conversations, and wiretaps, here is a reconstruction of what police believe really happened to Bill, Bridget, and Caleb Harrison. Ever since July 1st, 2005, when Caleb had climbed behind the wheel of his mother's fancy Mercedes-Benz car and decided to drive home from a party even though he knew he was intoxicated, Caleb's killer had decided that Caleb was just another dangerous and drunken rich kid who should be locked up in jail for a long, long time. The killer had even done their best to make that happen by circulating a petition on Facebook calling for Caleb to get the maximum possible sentence for the drunk driving accident that had killed one person and badly injured two others. Instead, Caleb was out of prison after only 3 months and back to living his life of privilege in his family's great big house on Pitchpine Crescent. As far as the killer was concerned, no matter how big a mess Caleb made of other people's lives, all he had to do was run to mom and dad, and they would make sure that Caleb got what Caleb wanted. It had been incredibly easy to kill Caleb's mother, Bridget. All the killer had to do was wait until she was alone, walk right up to the front door, ring the bell, and then when Bridget answered, her purse in hand, the killer offered her a package, supposedly for her grandchildren. As Bridget reached out to take it, the killer had stepped inside, closing the door behind them and forcing Bridget backwards into the short hallway towards the bottom of the staircase. Bridget had barely had time to react before the first blows landed on her face, head, and chest. Then the killer wrapped their hands around Bridget's throat and squeezed harder and harder, fracturing the cartilage around her voice box and breaking her neck in several places. Within minutes, Bridget had stopped breathing, her lifeless body draped over the last 2 bottom steps of the stairway. Moments later, the killer had slipped back outside, and after walking casually to where they had parked some distance from the Harrisons' house, the killer had hopped behind the wheel of their car and driven slowly out of the quiet and sheltered neighborhood. But now, it was 4 years later, and the killer was back. It wasn't enough that both Bill and Bridget Harrison were now dead. The real problem all along had been Caleb. As the clock ticked over from Thursday night of August 22nd into the early morning hours of Friday, August 23rd, the killer arrived at Pitchpine Crescent. Dressed in new sneakers and latex gloves and carrying a baseball bat, the killer quietly stepped to the front entryway just off the driveway. Unlocking the door, the killer slipped inside. Careful not to make any noise, the killer passed by the small bathroom on the right where Bill had died just over 4 years ago. Then, walking over the exact spot where the killer had beaten and strangled Bridget 3 years earlier, the killer climbed the steps to the second floor. Turning left at the top of the stairs, the killer followed the low hum of the bedroom fan to the end of the hallway, right to the door of the master bedroom. Soundlessly, the killer opened that door and stepped inside. Taking a deep breath, the killer allowed their eyes to adjust to the darkness before moving over to the bed where Caleb lay asleep, his eyes covered by a sleep mask. The killer noticed with distaste the layer of dust and dog hair that covered the bedroom floor carpet. And then, raising the baseball bat high over his head, the killer delivered a crushing blow to Caleb's chest. But instead of killing or immobilizing their victim, the sudden attack caused Caleb to literally spring up from the bed, ripping the face mask from his eyes and confronting his murderer. The struggle that followed did not last long. Caleb's attacker was huge, standing 6 foot 4 inches tall and weighing nearly 400 pounds. The killer literally threw Caleb into the shelving unit next to Caleb's bed. Then, ignoring Caleb's pleas for mercy and Caleb's offer of money, the killer stepped into the narrow space between the wall and the bed where Caleb sat in a crouch. Still not saying a word, Caleb's murderer wrapped his giant hands around Caleb's neck and strangled him to death. Then, Christopher Fattori, Melissa's new husband and the stepfather of Caleb and Melissa's 2 children, picked up Caleb's dead body and arranged it on top of Caleb's bed, pulling the blanket up to Caleb's chin and tucking the edges of the blanket around the side of Caleb's body. Retracing his steps, Chris made his way back downstairs to the front door. Before letting himself out, he patted his pants pocket to make sure he still had the key to 3635 Pitchpine Crescent that he had stolen from Caleb's 12-year-old son, Mason. With Melissa's ex-husband dead, Melissa would no longer have to beg and fight for custody of their 2 children. and Chris would no longer have to worry about Caleb endangering the lives of the stepchildren that he, Chris, was also helping to raise. What Chris didn't know was that during Caleb's doomed attempt to defend himself against Chris, Caleb had managed to scratch Chris deeply enough that the medical examiner would later scrape Chris's DNA from under Caleb's fingernails. And when police went back through the files in the earlier investigation into Bridget's death 3 years ago, they found critical holes and inconsistencies in the alibis that Melissa and Chris had provided police. Meanwhile, information police had discovered from the day of Caleb's murder also left Melissa and Chris without solid alibis for Caleb's murder. Those discoveries immediately pushed Chris and Melissa to the top of the suspect list. But what detectives needed now were DNA samples they could compare to the tissues found under Caleb's fingernails. So, starting in late August, police began a surveillance operation so they could collect additional evidence. Within a week of Caleb's death, detectives hit pay dirt. They were able to get a sample of Chris's DNA from a cup he had drunk from and then thrown away in a public trash bin. The DNA from the saliva sample on the cup matched the tissue samples from under Caleb's fingernails. Police posing as garbage collectors were also able to find the shoes and gloves that Chris had worn the night of the murder. The dog hair and dirt on the bottom of those shoes matched the hair and dirt on the carpet in Caleb's bedroom, and the gloves contained DNA from both Chris and Caleb. It would turn out that each of the 3 Harrison family murders coincided with some critical turning point in Melissa and Caleb's bitter and long-running custody battle over their 2 kids. Police believe that Bill Harrison may have been alerted back on April 16, 2005, by a neighbor that Melissa and Chris were packing up their house, and it looked like maybe they planned to take the kids and leave town for good. Investigators speculated that Bill must have confronted Chris and Melissa and made it clear that he would call the police if they fled. And then Chris had followed Bill back to his home at Pitch Pine Crescent, and before Bill could take any action to stop the abduction of his grandchildren, Chris had strangled him, breaking Bill's sternum in the process. On the same day that Bridget discovered Bill's body, Chris and Melissa had taken the children off to Nova Scotia, where they would successfully hide for the next 7 months. Bridget Harrison had been killed a year later, one day before she was scheduled to testify at Melissa's parental abduction trial. Caleb Harrison had been murdered 3 years later, just before the custody arrangement he had with Melissa was about to change from Melissa getting unsupervised access to the kids back to Melissa getting only supervised visitation. Melissa Merritt and Christopher Fattori were both arrested on January 28, 2014, in a small community in Nova Scotia named Italy Cross. 2 weeks after Caleb's murder, as soon as Melissa was granted sole custody of Mason and Michaela, Melissa and Chris had packed up a few possessions and all 6 of their kids, and once again left Mississauga to head back to Canada's easternmost province. While they were in Nova Scotia, police found additional evidence on the laptop that the couple had left behind in Mississauga and on wiretapped conversations between Chris and Melissa to implicate Chris in the possible murder of Bill Harrison and to charge Melissa as a co-conspirator in the deaths of Bridget and Caleb Harrison. After their arrest, Chris confessed to the murders of Bridget and Caleb, insisting that he had done it for the sake of Melissa and the kids, and that Melissa had no knowledge or involvement. On January 13, 2018, 8 years after Caleb's death, Chris and Melissa were both found guilty of Caleb's murder. Chris alone was found guilty of Bridget's murder and not guilty in the death of Bill Harrison due to lack of evidence, like an actual body or autopsy report. Chris and Melissa were both sentenced to life in prison with a chance of parole after 25 years. The Harrison children were sent to live with Melissa's family. Later, in 2018, Melissa married a fellow prison inmate named Sheena McIntosh. In 2020, Chris Fattori started an online dating profile in which he described himself as very fit, fun, caring, easygoing, generous, and down-to-earth. Also in 2020, the Peel Regional Police Force was the subject of an internal review that found serious errors in how they handled and investigated the deaths of Bill and Bridget Harrison. On January 5, 2023, Melissa's murder conviction was overturned after the Ontario Court of Appeals ruled that there had been two serious errors in the instruction given to the jury regarding key evidence. Melissa remains in prison while awaiting her new trial. In 2007, the now famous cult classic movie Into the Wild was released to movie theaters for the first time. The movie, which is based on a true story, centers on the life of a young man named Christopher McCandless. In 1990, Christopher graduated from a really good school with honors, and by all accounts, he could have gone on to get a really good, high-paying job, but Christopher didn't want a job. He wanted freedom. And so without telling his parents, because they would not have been happy about this idea, he gave away all of his possessions, he gave all his money to charity, and he headed off to Alaska to live off the grid by himself. He eventually would find this rusted-out old city bus in the middle of the Alaskan wilderness, and he would make this bus his shelter, and he would live inside of this bus for 113 days before he unfortunately died of starvation. While Christopher's story is obviously tragic, the movie about his life, Into the Wild, really focuses on Christopher's unrelenting spirit and his constant drive towards getting the thing he wants the most, which is freedom. And so at the end of this movie, the audience is left feeling not sad, but inspired. Inspired to take big risks in life and seek out adventure before it's too late. One audience member who was totally inspired by Christopher McCandless's life story was an 18-year-old young man named Matt Higgins who lived in Oregon. Matt was about to graduate high school, and unlike a lot of his peers, he had no idea what he should do after graduation, whether it was get a job or go to school. But after watching Into the Wild, a third option appeared to him, which was to head off into the wild, just like Christopher McCandless had done, except not permanently. Matt quickly fell in love with this option. He viewed it as a chance to kind of take a break from reality and go find himself, and then at the end of his stint in the wild, he could come back and, get a job or go to school. And so Matt's official Into the Wild plan was that he would graduate in 2007, and then in the spring of 2008, he would hike the entirety of the California section of the infamously rugged and beautiful Pacific Crest Trail. And he would do this all on his own. This section of the Pacific Crest Trail that he planned on hiking was roughly 1,700 miles long. It began on the border of Mexico and Southern California, and it wound its way north up to the border of Oregon. The trail cut through deserts and up and over mountains, and there was lots of dangerous wildlife to contend with. And on top of that, there were many points along this trail where hikers were very isolated. They were not anywhere near civilization, and so if anything were to happen to them, they'd be on their own. And so naturally, this hike was not a beginner hike. However, Matt was not a beginner hiker. He had grown up hiking and camping all over Oregon and the western United States. He had spent time in totally well-marked and safe areas, and he had also spent time hiking around very dangerous and isolated areas where there were cougars and bears and unmarked cliffs everywhere. And so Matt felt like, with his experience in the outdoors, he was perfectly suited to take on this big of an adventure. And in many ways, that was true. However, something was going to happen to him while he was out on the Pacific Crest Trail that no amount of hiking or camping experience could have prepared him for. So Matt graduated from high school in 2007, and in keeping with his plan, in the spring of 2008, he packed up his stuff, he headed to the airport, and he flew south to Southern California. And when he got there, he made his way all the way south to the border of Mexico, and there he picked up the start of the Pacific Crest Trail, and he began heading north. For the first few weeks of his hike, Matt would spend the entire day hiking as far as his body would allow him, and then at night, when it got too dark or when he got too tired, he would just set up his campsite right off the edge of the trail, and then after a quick bite to eat, he'd climb inside of his tent and he'd go to sleep. And then the next day, he'd get up early and he'd do it all over again. During those first few weeks, the only real adversity that Matt ever faced, beyond just kind of normal fatigue from long-distance hiking, was at one point he got a little dehydrated, and another time he almost stepped on a rattlesnake. So besides those two things, really the hike had actually been fairly routine by Matt's standards. But when he reached the Lassen National Forest, which is a very dense forest in Northern California, located about 150 miles from the end of his hike, so the border of Oregon, when he got there, this hike of his would become anything but routine. Not long after stepping foot in Lassen Forest, Matt found himself walking along this winding dirt path where the trees on both sides of this path were pressed tightly up against the edges of this trail, and because of how densely packed the trees were together, it was almost like he had these walls on either side of him that extended 100 feet into the air. And so it was very quiet and it was very dark as he was walking along, but Matt was enjoying it. All he could hear was the chirping of birds and the insects buzzing around him. It was peaceful. And so Matt's just kind of meandering his way through the forest. He's in no rush. And at some point, the trail he was on banked hard to the right. And so he makes this turn, and as he does, he looks up, and what he sees kind of startles him. About 20 feet away from him, off to the right side of the trail, is this big boulder, and sitting on this boulder are two middle-aged people, a man and a woman. They were both dressed head to toe in white. They both looked very dirty and disheveled. The man had this big, unkempt beard, and both of them were just staring daggers at Matt. And so Matt felt awkward, and he immediately looked down as he continued walking towards them. But as he got within a few feet, he looked up and kind of awkwardly smiled at them and waved and said hi, and they didn't respond. They just continued to stare at him with no discernible expression on their face, and they watched him as he walked right past them. And so after Matt walked past these two people in white, he felt really uncomfortable because he knew they were still definitely staring at him as he walked away, and he didn't want to turn around and meet their eye contact. And so he's just kind of walking away, feeling that uncomfortable feeling of someone staring at him, and he's thinking to himself, why didn't they at least wave or acknowledge him in some way? Especially considering the fact that on the Pacific Crest Trail, people go days without seeing other people. Matt, in fact, had not seen another person in days until he saw these two. And so he's thinking, how rude is that to just completely not react when another person walks past you on this trail? But Matt told himself, you know what, I don't know these people. I don't know what their issues are. For all I know, they're foreign and they didn't understand what I said. And so maybe that's why they didn't say hello back. Who knows? But you know what? It's none of my business. And so Matt just continued walking along. He never turned around to look back at these two people in white. He just carried on. A few hours later, when the sun was starting to set, Matt was still walking along this winding trail with these huge trees on either side of him, and so visibility was getting pretty poor, and so he began looking for a place to make his camp. But because of how close these trees were to the edge of this trail, and considering how dense these trees were, there was no spot for him to make his campsite without completely blocking the trail. And Matt did not want to block the trail for other people, and so what he did is he left the trail and he walked 300 feet or so into these thick trees where he found this little clearing, and that's where he set up his tent. Once it was all set up, he made some food for himself on his little stove, and then after he was done eating, he packaged up all of his leftover food inside of a waterproof bag, and he sealed that up. And then he tied some cord to the bag and threw the bag up and over a branch of a nearby tree and kind of tied it off so the bag was sitting well off the ground. This was to make sure no bears could get to his food. And so after his leftovers were secured high up in a tree, it was totally pitch black outside. And so Matt just climbed into his tent, he zipped it up, climbed into his sleeping bag, and he fell asleep. The next morning, Matt got up right as the sun was starting to rise, and so it was still pretty dark outside, but there was a little bit of light. And so Matt unzipped his tent and he looked outside, and the first thing he noticed was his bag of food that he had put up in the tree was gone. And so Matt stepped out of his tent and he looked around thinking, maybe it fell to the ground or something, but it wasn't there. It was just gone. And so Matt thought to himself, I didn't hear anything last night, but I guess a bear must have come into the campsite, found the food, and run off with it. And so Matt began walking over to the tree where he had strung the food up to begin looking on the ground for bear prints to confirm his theory that that was who took his food. And so he walks over, he's looking around, he doesn't see any bear prints, but he does see 2 sets of human boot prints, neither of which were his. And before he could even process that, he realized these prints, these human prints, were not just underneath this tree where the food was. These prints, as he looked around him, extended all the way up to his tent and all around his tent and all over his campsite. And so as Matt is looking at this crazy trail of human prints all over the place, he's thinking to himself, how is this possible? I went to bed last night when it was already pitch black outside, and I got up basically right at sunrise, so it was still dark outside. So these two people that were walking all over my campsite and cutting my food down, they somehow navigated here 300 feet off the main trail in the middle of nowhere. They navigated here in total pitch blackness, and they did it silently without waking me up. How is that even possible? And so after running through this thought process, Matt realized the only logical conclusion was that the two people he saw on the rock, the people in white, had followed him after seeing him. They saw where he left the trail, and they had waited until he fell asleep and then snuck out and robbed him. As Matt's thinking about this, he suddenly realized that maybe they're still around. Maybe he's still being watched. And so he began whipping his head around, looking in all directions, almost expecting to see the man and the woman in white kind of poking out from behind a tree. But when he looked around, he couldn't see anyone. However, he started to get that sense that he was being watched. And so feeling really uncomfortable, he quickly packed up his campsite and walked as quickly and calmly as he could toward the trail. And as he walked, he kept thinking to himself that these people are going to jump out from behind a tree, or they're going to grab me from behind. And so he's walking faster and faster and faster. And he finally gets to the trail, and he looks down the trail and up the trail. He kind of looks all around. He doesn't see anybody. And so he tells himself, okay, they're gone. So he took a deep breath, he composed himself, and he started walking north again along the trail. Matt walked for several hours, periodically looking over his shoulder, again expecting to see the man and woman in white. But he never did, and eventually this narrow path kind of cutting through the dense forest opened up to this big, beautiful field, and by that point the sun was high in the sky, and so Matt's walking in this very beautiful open area. He can see in all directions, there's sunlight beaming down on him, and so even though he was totally rattled by what had happened the night before, he found himself kind of becoming more at ease about the situation. He was far less paranoid, and he began telling himself, as creepy as it is that those people in white almost certainly followed him and snuck up on his campsite in the middle of the night, as bad as that is, he thought, you know what? They probably were just super hungry and they clearly needed the food more than he did. And so, you know what? Those people, they can have my food, whatever. And so Matt just continued on telling himself he would never have to deal with the people in white ever again. However, he would be wrong. Over the next 3 days, Matt continued making his way north through the Lassen forest, and the trail he was on would weave between those big, beautiful open areas back inside those very densely forested areas where the trees were practically right on top of you. And during those 3 days, Matt did not see the people in white. He did not have any nighttime encounters with anybody. Nothing got stolen. And so that only reinforced the idea that, he had been a target of opportunity. They had taken what they wanted from him and they were no longer following him. But on the 4th day after the food stealing incident, things would get spooky for Matt again. On that 4th night, Matt was once again forced to leave the trail he was on. He was in one of those very densely forested areas and walk well off the trail to find a clearing for his tent. And so he walked, several hundred feet away. He finds this clearing. He sets up his tent. And then also he sets up a perimeter of sticks all around the outside of his campsite. This was a precaution he had begun taking after the food stealing incident. These sticks were an early warning system where if any animal or person came too close to his campsite, they would step, in theory, on these sticks and they would break and they would alert Matt in the middle of the night. And so after his campsite was all set up and all prepared, Matt sat down and had a quick bite to eat, and then after storing his food, he climbed inside of his tent and he fell asleep. A few hours later, Matt suddenly woke up. Now, when he woke up, he opened his eyes, but it's pitch black in his tent, there are no windows in his tent, and it's pitch black outside, so even with his eyes open, he can't see anything. And so he's just laying there with his eyes open, but it's total darkness, and he's just listening intently, because he doesn't really know why he woke up, if something startled him, or if there's no reason at all. And so he's just laying there and he's listening, and as he's listening, he hears the distinct sound of something stepping on one of the sticks in his perimeter. And so he hears the stick break and his heart just starts racing because he knows that an animal or a person is just a few feet away from him. And so instinctively, he kind of begins to pull his arm as quietly as he can out of his sleeping bag, and he reaches over and he grabs his hunting knife. And as he grabs the handle of the knife and he brings it closer to him, he hears the sound of more footsteps. Whatever has stepped on the stick has not slowed down at all. They don't care about the sound they just made. They're still moving towards his tent. And so Matt's starting to get really freaked out because he knows that, it could be an animal, but just a couple of days ago, 2 people were in his campsite stealing his food and walking all around his tent. And so that's what's going through his head. And so Matt's laying there preparing himself to potentially have to slash out if anybody came close to his tent. I mean, he's in the middle of nowhere. If a person is out here, it's not his friend. And so he's laying there, he's kind of shaking and he's listening really intently, and the footsteps are just getting closer and closer and closer to his tent until they stop right next to his head. They are literally about a foot away from him. And so he can't see anything, he's just listening really intently, and then he starts to hear whispering. But the whispering is not coming from this person right here. The whispering is coming from everywhere in the forest. It's coming from all different directions. And so Matt doesn't know what to think about this, and as he's hearing this whispering, which is getting more and more frantic, whoever is standing right outside of his tent begins circling his tent. So now he hears footsteps just walking in a circle around his tent while frantic whispers are coming in from all directions. And so at this point, Matt is so terrified, he's just frozen. He knows that he's holding that knife, but he won't be able to do anything with it. He's just petrified. And then as soon as this total nightmare had begun, it just stopped. The whispering, silence. The footsteps stopped. And so in a way, it was kind of relieving, but in another way, Matt's laying there thinking, I want to hear the sound of footsteps retreating into the forest, leaving, but I haven't heard that. It went from footsteps all around the tent and whispering everywhere to silence as if whoever is out there is still out there and they're just standing there waiting for him. And because it's so dark, he can't even look. He can't look outside and see. And so he's left just laying in his tent wondering if 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 people are just waiting outside of his tent. He's got no idea. And so finally the sun would come up in the morning, and again, Matt has not heard the sound of retreating footsteps, and so maybe they're still just standing outside. But once the sun had totally come up and there was some light outside that he could see through his tent, Matt decided he just had to check. And so he reached over and he quickly unzipped the flap of the tent and he looked outside. He didn't see anyone. He leapt outside with his knife, ready to confront anyone who was out there, but there was no one. And so Matt, he's not thinking, oh great, they're gone. He's thinking, are they just like a few feet away, hiding behind trees? And so for a few minutes, Matt just began looking all around his campsite, kind of expecting to see, those people in white or other people he doesn't know, but he doesn't see anyone. And then Matt starts thinking to himself, was this just a nightmare? Did that not even happen? Am I imagining this? But when he looked down, he saw clear boot prints all over his campsite, including a nice track all the way around his tent. And so this nightmare really had played out in real life. And so he quickly gets everything back into his pack, he throws it on his shoulder, and he just starts running back towards the trail. And when he got to the trail, he continued running north. And as he's running along and looking over his shoulder the whole time, he's telling himself, I just need to get out of Lassen National Forest. I need to get out of the people in white's turf, get away from this place, and I'll be left alone. And so that motivated him to spend the whole day moving as fast as he possibly could. And by that afternoon, he had finally escaped Lassen National Forest. He was out and he was in one of these smaller towns that kind of butted up alongside this forest. And so that night, he camped out right near this town. He wanted to be as close to civilization as possible to ensure his safety. And so as he's laying in his tent that night, he began thinking about what had happened over the past couple of days. At this point, he was nearly certain that the people in white that he had seen on that boulder, they had to be behind these nighttime encounters. They just had to be. And so he's thinking to himself, okay, well, the first encounter I had with them, when they stole his food, yeah, that's creepy, but it makes sense. They followed him, they went to his campsite, they stole his food. Okay, fine. That makes sense to him. But the second encounter, the one that had happened the night before, that didn't make any sense. Assuming it was, again, the people in white responsible, That meant they had been following Matt the whole time, and he had not seen them somehow, even though over the last couple of days, he had been looking over his shoulder constantly, looking for those people. But he didn't see them, and they still managed to follow him all the way over several days to this other unmarked campsite hundreds of feet off the main trail. So how did they do that? And then two, once they were at his campsite and he's laying there listening to them, walking around the campsite, whispering to each other, what were they doing? And then how did the footsteps and whispering just stop immediately and he didn't even hear the sound of them retreating into the woods? How did they do that? And so Matt would go over this until finally he would fall asleep. And then the next morning when he got up, it was the first thing he was thinking about, the people in white. What were they doing and why and where were they? And so as Matt packed up his campsite that morning, it did cross his mind, that maybe he should just stop the hike right now and call his family, have them come pick him up and get out of here. But this hike, this huge hike he had planned, was really important to him, and he was only about 100 miles away from the finish line, which meant he had already hiked over 1,600 miles, and he just didn't want to quit. He wanted to finish what he started. And so he packed up his stuff, he threw it over his shoulder, and he continued on. And so that day, Matt would leave that little town and he would make his way up into another very dense forest called the Mount Shasta forest. Mount Shasta was a lot like the Lassen forest, except Mount Shasta has a very disturbing backstory. Specifically, lots and lots of people go missing inside of Mount Shasta, and often they go missing under baffling circumstances. The most frightening of these missing persons reports are when someone comes back, the survivor of the event, and they will say, they saw their hiking companion. They clearly saw them. And then they turned their back on them just for a few moments, few minutes, whatever it was. And when they turned back around, the person they were with was now gone. No trace of them, nothing. They're just gone. And despite a massive search for them, they're never found again. There is a distressing number of missing people in Mount Shasta that sound just like that. It's totally terrifying. So with that in mind, Matt makes his way into the Mount Shasta forest, and even though it totally stressed him out to once again be walking on these dirt pathways where the trees are very tight on either side of you, they're very dense, and as he's walking, he's kind of looking in both directions, expecting to see somebody watching him. Despite feeling that way, Matt just continued to stay focused and kept telling himself to just continue on because you're so close to the end. And so the first 3 days that he was in the Mount Shasta forest, Matt would just keep his head down and very stoically every day, he would just hike as far as he possibly could. In the evening, he would set up his campsite either right off the trail or maybe a little ways off the trail in a clearing. And he didn't have any run-ins with the people in white or anybody else for that matter. He was totally left alone. But on his 4th day in the Mount Shasta forest, all that would change. On that 4th day, Matt found himself not inside one of those very dense forested areas, but rather in this very open trail that was up on the side of this mountain. And because this trail was fairly high up in elevation, the tree coverage was fairly sparse, and so there was great visibility. He could see miles ahead of him, and when he turned around, he could see miles behind him. And so Matt is just walking along this trail, kind of enjoying the day. It's beautiful outside, and at some point, he turns around and looks behind him. Now, all day he'd been doing that, and he had not seen anyone. But this time, when he turned around, he saw 2 little white dots, miles and miles back, slowly making their way along the trail that he was on. It was the people in white. They were back. At this point, Matt was at least 50 miles or more away from that first place he had walked past the people in white when they were sitting on that boulder. Which meant, 1, Matt was right. These people in white really had followed him and almost certainly were responsible for the nighttime visits he was getting. And 2, for reasons unknown, they were still following him. Matt suddenly didn't care at all about completing his big hike. He just wanted to get the heck away from those people. And so very quickly he pulled out his map and he looked, and to his horror, he realized he was in one of the most isolated portions of the entire hike. He was at least 25 miles away from the nearest civilization, a little town called Castella, California. And so without a better option, Matt put the map back in his pocket. He took one last look at the people in white who were making steady gains on him, and then Matt just turned away from them and began booking it down the trail. And Matt would run for hours and hours and hours without stopping. Even when he turned around and could no longer see the people in white, he just kept on running. And then when the sun set and he could barely see the trail, he just kept on running. It literally wasn't until it was so dark outside that he actually couldn't see the ground anymore that Matt finally, totally exhausted, came to a stop. And then from there, he turned and left the trail and walked way away from the trail, hundreds of feet deep into the forest, to get as far away from these people in white as he possibly could. And so finally, he found this clearing very far away from the trail. He set up his tent right in the middle of it, and then he very diligently laid out his perimeter of sticks around his campsite, making sure there were no gaps. And then he climbed inside of his tent, he zipped it up, and then keeping on all of his stuff in case he needed to make a run for it, he got inside of his sleeping bag and he just laid there with no expectation that he was going to sleep. He was terrified. As he laid there, he thought to himself, okay, I have now run at least several miles ahead of them. I know that was them. I know I got some distance on them. There's no way they saw where I turned off the trail and where I've set up this campsite, so they can't possibly find me. And so Matt would lay in the tent for several hours just waiting to fall asleep. And then finally he would start to get tired because at this point it's totally quiet outside. He hasn't heard anything. And so he begins to doze off to sleep. And as he's getting more and more tired, he hears the sound of someone stepping on his perimeter of sticks. And as soon as he hears that stick break, he hears the all too familiar whispering pick up all around the forest. And then something new happens. Before Matt can even do anything, his tent lights up like a Christmas tree. Someone is shining a light on his tent. Someone has snuck up on his campsite in the middle of nowhere, hundreds and hundreds of feet off the trail, in the middle of the night. They've found him, and they're shining a light on him. And then the light clicks off, and it's silent. And at this point, Matt's fight or flight instinct kicks in, and he rips off his sleeping bag, he jumps outside, and begins screaming nonsense and flailing around with a knife, trying to intimidate these people to get away from him. And then after he stops for a second, he hears a stick crunch right behind him. And he whips his head around to look at who is standing right behind him. And as he's turning out of his peripheral vision, he sees a dark figure running towards him. He doesn't think twice, he just turns and begins running away from the campsite. Now remember, it's pitch black in the forest. There's trees everywhere. And so Matt's smashing into trees, branches are hitting him, he's falling to the ground, but he is on a pure adrenaline high and he is just sprinting as fast as he possibly can away from this person who is likely still chasing him. And after 5 minutes of running, he stumbles and falls forward and kind of lands at the base of this fallen tree. The tree had landed in such a way that it was kind of propped on a rock. So there was a small gap underneath the tree. And so Matt, thinking quickly, kind of slid himself underneath this log and positioned himself so he was looking back in the direction he was running from. And as he laid there, he saw in the distance this light bobbing around. These people are looking for him. They're searching the forest for him. And so he watched in horror, tucked underneath this log, as whoever had the light and whoever else was with them, they moved closer and closer and closer, but they did not find him tucked underneath the log. They just walked right on past him. And so Matt would remain underneath this log all night until finally the sun came up. And at that point, even though it was fairly obvious that whoever was looking for him, they were now gone, Matt was still terrified, and so he stayed under the log for several hours until it was about early afternoon, and then he finally pulled himself out from under the log, and he looked around. He couldn't see anyone, and then instead of going back to his campsite and getting his gear, he just totally abandoned it. He was worried that these people in white, or whoever it was, that they were still going to be there. And so he just turned and continued running away from his campsite back out to the trail. And once he got the trail, he continued running on the trail all the way to Costella, California. And when he got there, he hitchhiked his way to the town of Mount Shasta. And there he would speak to police as well as the Forestry Service about what he had experienced. And so they would take all of his information down and they would put him up in a motel for the night. And then the next day, Matt would get in touch with his family and they would drive from Oregon to Mount Shasta. They would pick him up and they would take him back home. Months later, Matt would contact the Mount Shasta Police and the Forest Service and would just follow up and say, hey, have you learned anything else about these people in white? Have you caught them? Has anybody else come forward? And the police would say, they did have a number of people coming forward saying that things had been stolen from their campsites. These are people that were in Mount Shasta, in Lassen Forest, and the surrounding forests. But Matt was the only one who had reported being terrorized by this mysterious couple in white. And so to this day, Matt has no idea who those two people were, what they wanted with him, beyond obviously the food they took. They continued to stalk him for nearly 100 miles, and he has no idea how they were able to keep finding his campsites that were hundreds of feet off the main trail in unmarked areas that they would somehow navigate to in total darkness without alerting Matt. It's all a big mystery. Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballin podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please hide a Bluetooth speaker in the 5-star review button's bedroom and then proceed to play Siberian Husky screaming audio at full volume all night long. Also, please subscribe to the Mr. Ballin podcast on Amazon Music, because starting November 1st of this year, 2022, our podcast is only going to be available on Amazon Music. However, from now until November 1st, you can still get the podcast on all platforms: YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google, everywhere. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories we have posted on our main YouTube channel, which is just called Mr. Ballin. We now have a registered 501c3 charitable organization called the Mr. Ballin Foundation that makes it as easy as possible for you to join me, my family, and my team in supporting those whose lives have been most impacted by violent and heinous crimes. Monthly donors to the Mr. Ballin Foundation